In the age where independent video games can stand toe-to-toe, if not head and shoulders above the competition of their AAA counterparts, there are few developers who can claim as much influence and dedication as David Szymanski. His titles, with notable and famous releases like Dusk and Iron Lung, stand as extremely powerful examples of the clout and raw power a single man can hold in the video game industry, while still being down-to-earth and uncorrupted by the allure of fame and recognition. The man is a household name for his field because of these tireless efforts to keep making games no matter what, wearing his influences on his sleeve and making what he wants to see in the world. But it wasn't always that way. Few remember it, but there was a time where the man behind Iron Lung was but a man with a dream and a laundry list of ideas slaving away in QBasic, releasing several games to relative obscurity, but who never gave up and was able to cultivate himself into a creative powerhouse. The life of Szymanski is just as interesting, if not more, than the sum of his games, and that's what I seek to explore and document with my video. I'm going to be going through every single one of his games in chronological order, from the beginning to his most recent game as of 2025, which I'm sure will be outdated soon enough. Analyzing the very start of his development career will help us build a repertoire of his strengths and weaknesses, to see how he's improved and what could still use some fine-tuning. I'll only be covering games he primarily developed or at least had a significant hand in developing, so games he's produced or had very minor involvement in don't count. Also, the games have to be at least accessible to play. I can't really review a game that isn't available, can I? I'll be creating a tier list that ranks each game from my favorite to least favorite, updated all throughout the video. Hey, my name's Peter, and these kinds of strange, obscure, and underrated games are a mainstay on this channel, so I hope you at least consider those like and subscription buttons if you're enjoying yourself. If you feel so inclined, I also have a Patreon full of exclusive videos with frequent updates for your liking, or YouTube memberships for the same benefits. Huge thank you to my Jawcoin tier supporters. You're the ones who make all this possible. Without further ado, brothers and sisters, let's explore the wild world of David Szymanski games. In 1993, Cyan Inc. released their premier title, Myst, and the world of video games has never been the same since. Without going into too much detail, Myst totally redefined the sense of adventure video games could provide with its fully 3D environment and unparalleled ability to tell its story with subtlety and grace. Everyone's at least heard of Myst if they haven't played it. Countless people were inspired by its jaw-dropping visuals and presentation at the time, but perhaps none more than a young David Szymanski. While he played Myst on his Macintosh computer, a thought sparked in his mind. What if I could make something like Myst? Szymanski lived in rural Pennsylvania for most of his life. He never owned a video game console in his early childhood, instead preferring the computer to play video games. His hardware was never top of the line, nor did he or his siblings consistently have the money to buy the newest games. So much of his time spent gaming was huddling around older machines playing whatever first-person shooters or adventure games he can get his hands on, which stoked his imagination. This started Szymanski's hobby of programming and game design from the age of 12 years old. It was a hobby that had its ebbs and flows for him throughout his life growing up, but he never truly abandoned it. Around 2009 or 2010, Szymanski was attending Cedarville University in Ohio, studying music composition for around 2 years, but decided to transfer to a smaller college called Edinburgh for another 2 years to receive a degree in musical performance. He studied the violin, something he described as an instrument you have to contort your body in the most unpleasant way to play well.
Like, learning, practicing the violin and stuff is really just, you're contorting your body into a really unnatural, stressful position, and then you have to tell all your muscles to relax.
It was during this awkward transitional period of leaving post-secondary, struggling to find work outside of tuning pianos part-time, is where he discovered the Game Maker software, something substantially more capable and powerful than his ability to make simple games from QBasic. Szymanski wasn't working in a cultural black hole. He knew some indie developers could make livings from their games, but past just the monetary value, he valued the ability to share his creations with the world beyond anything else. It certainly beats looking up to Phil Fish, that at least. The storefront Szymanski put his simplistic games on were so obscure that Szymanski himself can't even recall their names retrospectively. At this time, he was silently building his skill set in publishing these games, which are almost entirely lost to time. They were largely for his own benefit, meant to benchmark his personal progress. Everything changed when he discovered Unity, which at the time was a good piece of software. A free AAA quality engine that's easy to learn and moderately difficult to master. It was the next best thing to having your own engine, minus all the intense programming it would require, something Szymanski still struggles with.
Because I suck at programming. And I have always sucked at programming, and everyone's like, no, it's fine, well, everyone does. But no, you don't understand. I barely have a grasp on object-oriented design.
What Szymanski always wanted to release was a first-person shooter game, but with his current set of skills, it was a far-flung dream that wasn't quite achievable. Yet. He was a married man with children. His responsibilities as a man and as a father were something he had to balance alongside game development. But never underestimate a man when his mind is made up. Armed with this new software on a bucket list, Szymanski worked throughout late 2013 and early 2014, and released something he described as a short, experimental horror game that focuses on atmosphere and story, completely for free, called Fingerbones. So let's take a look at it. I felt it necessary to introduce his experimentation with Unity right away because it has a reputation for being the catalyst of baby's first video game for many a creator. He made plenty of games prior, but this was the first one to gain any notoriety or have a real public release. And you can definitely tell it was a first-time Unity project. Fingerbones, in plainest of words, is a simple, minimalist horror walking simulator where you walk around a small bunker and read scattered notes to figure out what's going on. The whole game has a sort of Castle Miner Z aesthetic of blocky visuals that kinda look like Minecraft, but also not at all at the same time. The controls are just WASD to move, left click to interact, and escape for the main menu. The entire game operates by walking around at a frighteningly glacial pace with no seeming objective past reading some notes left by I guess we'll find out later. The author of these notes seems to be something of a Redditor pseudo-intellectual, because despite some kind of disaster or apocalypse occurring in his hometown, he's more focused on experimenting with the ideas that morality is largely something socially transmitted and not inherent to human beings, which is the gateway for only horrifying and shocking things and nothing else whatsoever. This bunker was built by a father to house his wife and daughter, but the wife and him were estranged after a prior divorce. So she died pretty quickly from the unspecified event that killed everyone else. These scraps of information are fed to us in one of the more unpleasant ways I've ever seen for an indie game. Locked doors impede our progress, and the solution is to leave the room and come back, and it will be magically unlocked. Swing and a miss on doing a lot with a little. One positive I have to mention is that light coming from the windows here looks genuinely beautiful and contrasts splendidly with the lifeless grays of the bunker, and that's about the extent of the positive comments I have to say. The author of these notes clearly has some kind of issue with women in general. His feelings on his wife are complicated, even more so for his daughter, and things really come to a filthy boil when we finally open up the safe here and find some kind of blocky objects we can't quite make out. Along with another note telling us that the cellar is freedom, cellar being the password needed to open the cellar door that's been eluding us the entire game. The author begins to succumb to the effects of isolation and prattles about desires kept in the back of his mind, and how his daughter is the only woman he's seen in years. And given that morality has no use for survival in his mind, I think we all know what kind of desires are being implied here. Food has become so scarce that his father sees no further use for his daughter, so he chucks her in the cellar, leaves her to die of a cause he didn't care enough to write down. But he did keep her finger bones in the cellar as a reminder of who she was. Our flashlight loses power, and we're left to ruminate in the dark, with some text revealing that, predictably, we were playing as the father, the author of these notes, the whole time. Even with my relatively low expectations, Fingerbones still fails to deliver. I don't have any issues with how the game looked or the story being conveyed through reading scattered notes, because it's a free game, for crying out loud. It's essentially a tech demo. But on the other hand, there are still a handful of aspects I found just baffling. Was there any reason for this character to move so slowly? Was a sprint button out of the question? Was leaving the room the only way to trigger the doors opening? The bar was raised so low that I just tripped over it. It took me maybe 15 minutes to beat this, but that 15 minutes felt like a better 5 minutes stretched precariously to extend length. What Fingerbones lacks in fun or satisfaction is a surprisingly thought-provoking idea of morality entirely being a social construct rather than an inherent human trait. At first, it doesn't seem like Fingerbones is going to answer that question, but as we gain an understanding of the father's actions, the ending, which leaves him alone with his thoughts, is our answer. It isn't meant just to provoke the character, but rather the audience. I mean, if you need a video game to tell you that grooming your own child is a bad thing, then you might need to take a break from Reddit. You're left in a cosmic timeout, left to think about what you did. We don't get this kind of perspective or question in gaming all that often. To question the origin of morality. The protagonist, the biggest fan of John Lennon's Imagine, is missing the forest for the trees and simply acts as he wants to because no one is around to stop him. But from not saying anything at all, leaving him to question himself in the dark, the game gives you a pretty blunt answer. Do I recommend you play Fingerbones? No, not even remotely. There are plenty of other Unity games made by first-time developers that will provide comparable experiences while also feeling far more fun. But I have to hammer this point home. This was a free Unity game published for fun. There was no expectation of quality or fun times. Regardless, Fingerbones really took off in the YouTube indie horror scene, which was arguably at its zenith in 2014. It didn't really matter how mediocre your game was, it was very easy to get Markiplier or Corey Kenshin to gawk at a playthrough of it and gain a ton of attention very quickly, which is exactly what happened. Fingerbones enjoyed some moderate popularity after being featured in various YouTube playthroughs, though the opinion was almost unanimous. While the story was surprisingly thought-provoking and unique, the game is rough around the edges, to put it kindly. I have to rank this at the bottom of the tier list, to the surprise of no one. There's no shame in being a stepping stone meant to test the waters, but something has to be last place. However, past any minor fame or monetary value, Szymanski valued critique and advice far more than any material pleasures. His small game had a lot of eyes on it thanks to being picked up by the internet at large, so he decided to make his next game cost money, to see if he could outdo himself and even begin to make a living as an indie dev, which was still a relatively new and exclusive thing in the early 2010s. Szymanski wanted to develop his budding style of narrative walking simulators with dark themes, and took the criticism for Fingerbones and created his next game, The Moonsliver, released on October 2014 for Game Jolt and Steam Greenlight, a now defunct service that allowed people to put their games on Steam for a small fee. Yeah, it's Moonsliver, not Moonsilver. I don't know, man. It starts off almost identical to Fingerbones, but the leap in Szymanski's abilities is apparent instantly. The atmosphere on display here is palpably lonely. A Dust Bowl island filled with crumbled buildings, remains of trees, a kind of isolation that leaves you feeling dry in the mouth. The interface is far more comfortable to engage with, the walking speed feels appropriate. The way you consume the story has been elevated past just scraps of paper, though they are still present. The island is far larger than the tiny bunker of Fingerbones, which carries a set of ups and downs. It feels far more exciting to explore, but there are a few wrenches in the cogs. Your flashlight can run out of power, so it has to be recharged quite frequently at these power outlets. When the only way to consume the story is to walk and find items and locations, not being able to see any of the items because of an intentional mechanic is a questionable decision. There's no strategy other than railroading you to find the nearest outlet when it's around you. Otherwise, you spend more time fumbling in the dark for a reason I don't think justifies existing. I appreciate the attempt to add an extra dimension of strategy, but I don't think it has any place here. It just feels needless. The difference in size can also lead to a lot more meandering around the island, looking for one place you didn't explore in order to unlock the next segment of the story, something the much smaller bunker of Fingerbones had virtually nothing of. I'd still much rather spend time re-exploring each bunker here than boot up Fingerbones again, but while it showcases Szymanski's improvement as a game developer, I don't think it entirely stuck the landing. Specific locations in this island deliver small bits of character interaction told retrospectively from an unknown narrator. As soon as you start the game, you're told that there are only 4 people living on this island, but now there's 1. We're introduced to 4 characters, Elle, Isa, Daniel, and Abel, and given details that flesh them out non-linearly as you explore throughout the island. Szymanski seems to be in love with the idea of an implied, unspecified apocalypse or disaster forcing a small group of people to live together, because that's what we have again. The themes of blind faith and aging are put to the test as these characters live together for a long time, with Abel growing to regret the course of his life now that he's in the rear view mirror, or how Elle is suspicious of Daniel not spending as much time with her as he probably should be. Daniel loves adultery a lot, which gradually leads to the group fracturing and unable to fully trust each other. which bodes worse as the island's condition becomes bleaker and more desolate, food running out and water becoming poisoned. Daniel and Elle visit the bunker, only to be killed by some mysterious shadowy monster that's been lurking the whole time. The gang were all a part of some kind of cult worshipping something called the Moonsliver. He said it! He said it! Which Abel ends up destroying, and then the game kind of just ends ambiguously. There's more of a thematic meal to feast on here, even if it can sometimes feel more confusing because of its non-linear format. It's still an absolute improvement from the first game. It's just that some aspects feel like a monumental step forward, whilst others incremental. It's definitely a tier above Fingerbones. The most important difference is that the Moonsliver costed money, around $1 USD or $2 Canadian. It did well enough that Szymanski said he quit his part-time retail job at the time to pursue making most of his money through game development, something he started working on immediately after Moonsliver's release.
I threw that up on Greenlight and Itch, made a little bit of money on Itch. No one makes that much money on Itch. And eventually that went through Greenlight and went on Steam, and I was fairly lucky, and it did pretty well on Steam for the sort of game it was. I didn't make, $100,000, but I made much more money than I had ever made before selling games, and it was enough that I felt comfortable quitting.
He said his earning was hardly near six figures, but enough that regular development and releases were something not only achievable, but maintainable. With the money he earned from the Moonsliver and the powerful workflow he started to cultivate over the years of experience, he began to release games at a regular pace. The Music Machine came out in May 6th, 2015 on Steam and itch.io, which soundly replaced GameJolt as his preferred location to release his games. The Music Machine is unwavering in its dedication to the same themes as his previous game, no pun intended, isolation, religious indoctrination, but also adds some self-harm into it, because the protagonist is a young girl with one arm looking for a way to die on this island. The landscape we explore is simply jaw-dropping. The lighting mixed with the vibrant oranges and yellows makes for an incredibly unique and striking environment to run around in. The dead trees giving off staggering shadows everywhere we go. It is a very pretty game for the $5 price tag. However, aside from the visuals, I think everything else was a major step backwards. We revisit familiar territory with reading notes about a boy named Roger's experience at a Bible camp as he falls in love, becomes a man, goes a little insane, whatever. But the method most of this is delivered by somewhat botched this in my opinion. Our protagonist has dialogue this time, and boy does she sure let us know. We play as Haley, an edgy and sardonic 13-year-old girl exploring the island who is currently dealing with a two-spirit situation, because she's housing the spirit of a man named Quentin. The bickering between these two takes the lion's share of the dialogue, and while I hardly think it's annoying or outright unpleasant to read, it doesn't encourage me to explore my surroundings as much because the reward for a good eye is hearing a very stock back and forth dialogue from a tired dynamic of bitter old man with a heart of gold and bratty but still teen girl who is a surrogate daughter. It really did nothing for me, and I was kind of sick of hearing their debates take up a quarter of the screen almost all time throughout my playthrough. I found whatever nuggets of interesting information I could find is somewhat blocked out by either of them pointing out something astutely obvious, even despite the visual style making details hard to interpret. Like, I could guess the food in this obviously abandoned house is old. Do we really need to read several paragraphs of these two bickering about it? The Music Machine seems like one of Szymanski's more beloved walking simulators, so I'm sure people will disagree with me, but my time with this game was pretty short. I had other things to do. Fantastic visual style, I just didn't enjoy anything else. From what I understand, this game continues the plot of the Moonsliver, but I was kind of satisfied with that game as a one-shot. I really didn't feel enticed to play more. There are some minor mechanical improvements, however. A very basic physics system, sprinting, and even a rudimentary save system, something Szymanski has personally struggled with for a very long time, seeing that both of his prior games were very short experiences designed to be completed within an hour. What is the Music Machine? I didn't play long enough to find out, and I don't particularly want to. I rank it above Fingerbones, but below Moonsliver. On October 27th in the same year, Szymanski released A Wolf in Autumn, described as a game about a one-armed girl lost in the forest. Didn't we just play a game like that? Kind of. The concept of a one-armed girl protagonist is lifted straight from the previous game, but is used to far greater effect here. Wolf and Autumn is a puzzle game that's centered around the gimmick of playing as a 9-year-old girl with one arm, the titular Autumn. The best example I could give is that you need to move around the dark basement by gradually moving a flashlight to find a lighter, to light candles to see more of your environment, then circle back to the flashlight to continue exploration. The entire game operates like this as you explore the fenced-in area and basement Autumn is confined to, and I think most people felt it either far too gimmicky or just omitted it from the reviews, but I really like this aspect. It makes the exploration stand out far more than Szymanski's other games. Well, why is this child stuck in a basement in the first place? Well, it's because her mom is kind of crazy. The game opens from a monologue of her perspective, telling the audience how much she hates herself for being a woman, for feeling like she's wasted her life by raising her child. She refuses to admit this out of spite, because if she does, then she has to face the reality that she's unsatisfied with life. She locked her kid in this fenced area for some reason. The more we explore and try and find a way out, she gradually scolds us more and more.
I know you love to explore and play with machines, but this is for your own good. Do I have to pry off your kneecaps, you little shit? Do I have to nail your fucking arms to the floor? I will twist your legs off and break every bone in your ugly little body if I have to.
She has extreme contempt for her daughter, viewing her as the reason why she feels cheated in life, bitter at the world and herself. She inflicts this pain by horribly mistreating her daughter. Autumn is a creative, rambunctious little girl with a thirst for adventure, but she ends up doing heroin at 9 years old like Uncle Howie, and getting really into animal torture because she likes to hide remains of chipmunks in her room and attack dogs. Normally I'd make a crude joke, besides Uncle Howie, but I think this is a really spectacular representation of how abused children project their own hurt onto smaller, helpless creatures, something to alleviate the fact that they are the helpless creature being wounded by a bigger animal. The title is symbolic. The Wolf in Autumn isn't referring to an animal in a season, but rather the blossoming feelings of rage and violence inside this 9-year-old girl, which is genuinely heartbreaking to experience as you play. The game ends with Autumn running around an endless corridor as she's berated by her mother, only to wake up from a nightmare. Autumn and her mother share an awkward but heartfelt moment described entirely through text, as the game ends with a view of the ocean and a message that the game is dedicated to Rachel Szymanski. It feels kind of weird to dedicate a game about familial abuse to your spouse, but I guess she's chill like that. It's immediately apparent that Wolf and Autumn has far more to say than the previous games. It goes back to a smaller scale approach with character drama instead of a world-ending apocalypse, but is densely littered with puzzles that I quite enjoyed, if only for the novelty. But I do feel the need to mention this puzzle here, which is in the running for the most frustrating puzzle I've ever seen in any video game. You have to turn all these valves, then use a wrench on this microscopic part of the pipe, then leave the basement, which you think is impossible since you can't get on the steps, but you have to click on the steps, which loads you back into the fenced area, then fiddle with this part of to route the water through the pipes in a way that opens the lock inside, but only some combination of these switches allow the door to open, but not all of the combos are correct, only one. So more likely than not, you find a combo that opens the door, wait for a 15-second black screen, see the door is still locked, then leave, which is another 15-second screen. And then you just hope you find the correct combo. Why? Bro, just put the valves in the basement. What was the point of this? I was so mad. The ending is something of a mixed bag. On one hand, being text only is wildly disappointing. It totally annihilates the possibility of interesting symbolism or locales. We don't even get that ocean view until after that text dump. But on the other hand, it completely changes the interpretation of the events. Autumn and her mother seem to get along at least somewhat well, which is conflicting with the horrible abuse we see in-game. So we're left to question how much of this is really happening, how much is pure imagination, and how much is something mentally suppressed, manifested. The trope of everything being a dream is typically something hated because it removes all the agency and stakes of a situation via an unearned rug pull. But this game uses a dream to make us question what we just played, which very few pieces of media can pull off pretty well. The fenced-in area represents the pleasant conscious, and the dank basement is the subconscious, where all the venomous traits that Autumn has because of her mother's projection and hatred are stored, which can also be said about her mother, who presumably had her own figure to foster these feelings within her. It's a really damn fun way to experience parental abuse. Never thought I'd say that. Easily the best game Szymanski's made up to that point. But you know what's even more abused? The bloom. Wow, I can't see anything in this segment. Can we tone it down? Is Autumn going to be blind alongside being crippled? All 4 of these games are incredibly similar, and that's obvious to anyone still watching. Short, walking simulator style games with disturbing narratives features the concept of blind faith, interpersonal relationships being fumbled and collapsing, extreme isolation, and physical frailness. These games are all under 2 hours and are just distinct enough to pick your personal favorite without being too upsetting for other people. Some aspects are done better than others, but each game is just slightly more technically impressive than the last. I like to dub these 4 games the Walking Simulator Quadrilogy because of their shared likeness, and sometimes narratives. All of these games are so short you can easily play them and then refund them on Steam, which is something that not only Szymanski aware of, he somewhat encourages. He's been on record to say that if you don't like the game, then refund it.
I'm not afraid of refunds at all. Half of what I've done you can play in an hour, and it's not very replayable, and people still don't refund it. Some people do, but some people also pirate. Like, arguably that's even easier than refunding. It's just how it is.
This, among other traits, is what really endeared him to the indie game community. It's a roaring declaration of not only being a reasonable, down-to-earth guy, but a fair businessman and someone who respects your time, even if all his games are very cheap. He was earning a fairly steady income from 2 game releases a year, and his skills with Unity started to considerably increase. Each new game taught him something new. At least one of Unity's many tools became familiar to him as he slaved away at the keyboard. Short, contained releases are what allowed him to build his skill set to diversify, something he took stride to construct his old flame, something he's always wanted to make since the start of his career, all the way back when he played Myst, a first-person shooter. Szymanski knew this would be an effort unlike anything he'd ever partaken in, so he went several years without releasing a game. Well, at least a game made entirely by him. Michael Patrick Rogers, better known as Mikey Poo Games, was an indie dev mostly known for The Lady, which I believe was another game picked up on the YouTube indie horror scene. Szymanski had agreed to collaborate with Rogers and launched an Indiegogo page to fund their next game, The Grandfather. Was the Indiegogo page successful? No, not at all. It's tremendously difficult to find any information about this game at all, given that most of the videos featured on the campaign page were scrubbed from the internet. Szymanski programmed the game while Rogers wrote the story and directed the project. It released in 2016, and I have literally never heard anyone talk about this game, and you will see why. Oh god, do I have to talk about this? Well, it's certainly one of the games of all time, starring a character. It has a story. You play as the grandfather, a sad old man with a wife that hates him, which makes him very sad. We're told all of this as melodramatically as possible with narration I could scarcely hear under the tepid, dark ambient drones.
His cold-hearted, miserable, emotionless wife. She had made his existence beyond miserable, killing his desire to do everything he had ever loved to do in life.
The grandfather woke up as just a head, missing the rest of his body, and the game follows his journey to retrieve his body parts by playing some extremely confusing point-and-click segments. Confusing is an understatement. This is downright baffling and arcane. You float around his grandpa's head and click on random things in the environment to hopefully set off a chain reaction that makes you progress to the next screen. That's all I can describe it as. Stuff happens, like press the 2 outlets together 7 times, or force water to shoot out of your bathtub's sink and floor for some reason. These aren't really difficult, and these aren't really puzzles. It's just barely connected pieces of context-sensitive areas that can sometimes be dragged, sometimes be clicked on with no coherence or satisfaction. There doesn't really seem like there's a real connection between these things. You just slam your keyboard like a monkey and you'll end up on the next screen eventually. Nothing feels logical, even surreal, just stupid, nonsensical in the most miserable way. Like the win case was chosen out of a hat or done on a dare. To enjoy the story? I mean, that depends on how much you want to barely hear melodramatic rambling about how miserable this guy is and how much his life sucks. Game ends with you crushing your own heart in front of your wife and dying. Fitting that it ends like a boomer newspaper comic strip. I don't like to treat indie games coarsely, especially free ones, but this is one of those games you can feel the fact it achieved 15% of its Indiegogo goal. You can beat it in 20 minutes, and that sum of time manages to feel like nothing at all, but also entirely too long because of how little of a coherent game this is. It's more like a slideshow of watching the same events, but slightly different. I would love to learn more about this game because no one's talked about it and I feel like I've stumbled across a creepypasta. I understand the game wasn't intended to feel satisfying or fun in a traditional sense, but even as an experience meant to disturb, it doesn't feel like a successful venture. The artist they found to draw the illustration seems to know what they're doing, so I can't help but feel like this game would have worked better as a graphic novel. The game came out to a complete obscurity and I don't think it likely to make a resurgence. Rogers is trying to fund an indie film at the moment, but the advent of a collaboration is not something Szymanski would shun. In fact, you should get very used to this idea, because while this collaboration languished in the dark, the lessons learned from it would presumably pave the way for brighter paths. But before there was light, there was darkness.
Oh, yourself! Uh-oh.
Things weren't going quite as smoothly for Szymanski and his family at this point. He had been married and had 2 children, and his career as an indie developer was in a bit of an odd spot. A Wolf in Autumn was something he personally felt a little disappointed by, and excluding the grandfather, it was his least popular game. He had worked much of the bitterness of his previous part-time jobs and general anxieties into his life by the previous games. But A Wolf in Autumn is so different. In a series of retrospective tweets from the year 2021, when David Szymanski went back to play the game, he was floored by a lot of this. He said that he just didn't feel like the same man. He didn't really go into the specifics, but I do genuinely believe that A Wolf in Autumn touched and scraped some part of his mind locked away. It was a genuinely beautiful piece of expression that, while flawed, I think is one of his most emotionally pertinent and powerful games he's ever made. And I think he recognized that, and it kind of traumatized him a little. That was the game that really sent him into a burnout and made him kind of miserable for a couple of years. He's been on record saying that A Wolf in Autumn is his least favorite project, and that's most likely due to a multitude of reasons, from the technicals to the story. But knowing this context, it's impossible to not at least suggest that some of this backlash and burnout was the reason why he hates it so much, and perhaps felt the need to change something. Ultimately, this is what caused a deviation in his standard development cycle. He decided to do something different. He cleared his mind to clearly picture in his mind's eye of what game he wanted to make next, something he wanted to make ever since he had played Doom. It was finally time to make the game he had begun penning as a teenager. Szymanski was hard at work creating his ultimate first-person shooter game, something that stuck around in his mind for almost 2 decades. He had already decided on the name, Dusk, when he was 14 years old. He documented the early development process online on his YouTube channel, showing the prototypes, weapons, and textures.
Right now we are in a test level. This is by no means anywhere near even pre-alpha. This is just me playing around with what is it called? Playing around with Pro Builder. Taking my time on this one. I don't want to rush it. This is sort of the kind of game I've always wanted to make since I was young. So I, want to have fun making it and make sure that it's the best that I can.
He would have to learn several different aspects of game design on the fly, like a more robust and functioning save system, animation, especially lighting.
The one thing that I really wanted to do and couldn't figure out how to do was I wanted to do the flashlight similar to Half-Life or Deus Ex or like 90s games instead of... So, brief explanation. The flashlights they used in later 90s games, like Half-Life, was basically a sphere of light that would just get thrown out from your camera, and when it hit something, it was like, here, we're going to put a sphere of light here. And whatever that illuminates, that's why the beam doesn't get wider as it goes out in Half-Life. It's like a laser pointer.
Right.
And the way it works in Unity is much more realistic, where you have it's like a spotlight, it gets wider and has fall off. And I didn't want that. I wanted to do something like Half-Life, and at the time I just couldn't figure out how to do it.
Many bugs and quirks popped up during development, but he decided to keep many of these aspects purely for fun, like prop jumping. The texture work is an especially interesting point, because it was a blend of photo sources and hand-drawn, which was a result of trying to emulate the classic shooters like Quake or Doom that he loves so much, but also because he wasn't experienced in the field. These kind of retro shooters were not really being made in 2010s. Much of the ideas he wished to implement on Unity were totally foreign, and online tutorials were hardly present. He would really have to put all of his blood, sweat, and tears into this release, and he decided he didn't need to suffer alone. New Blood Interactive is a publishing studio that's become a household name overnight, but it wasn't always this way. At the time, they had only one game under their belt, a shmup called Super Galaxy Squadron, but one of its founders and the face of the company, Dave Oshry, was a figure that Szymanski knew from his previous work on a 2013 remake of an oft-forgotten 90s shooter called Rise of the Triad at the then-known Interceptor Entertainment. The two met and hit it off instantly.
But I really liked it, and so just on a whim, I sent him this demo, like thinking maybe he would tweet about it and, help me get some more followers or something like that. And he ended up messaging me back being like, holy crap, can we publish this? And I was like, wait, what?
New Blood agreed to publish Dusk, which came with a bevy of advantages, alleviating the pain of self-publishing, offering tremendous marketing, something New Blood is famous for on social media, and people could step in and regularly help Szymanski with any programming troubles. There were people who had his back, someone who could offer advice or even their time or talent to him. However, Oshry was insistent on a very specific kind of release strategy. Dusk had to launch on early access with the first episode available as a piecemeal episodic format, with episodes 2 and 3 coming out to address the potential critiques people had with the first episode. Early access is something New Blood is very comfortable with, as you can see. The price point of the game was around $20, which was actually a little contentious, because Oshry insisted that for the $20 price point, the game had to launch with a multiplayer mode, something which made Szymanski's heart stop. Anyone who's ever attempted programming should know this. When you involve networking, throw out everything you know out the window. It might seem insane that $20 is somehow the benchmark of needing an online mode, but New Blood is very particular with its price points. One of its main marketing slogans is, "We hate money." Networking and general QA testing is what caused Dusk to teeter from an entirely self-made project to a minor team effort, with New Blood bringing in Scott Gurney, a recently hired programmer, to aid Szymanski with whatever he was struggling with, or at least didn't feel like doing. The online mode, called Dusk World, was programmed largely by Gurney, but New Blood also brought in Dylan Rogers for assistance, and Rogers would strike up a good relationship with Szymanski in the coming years and become good friends. So there's two Daves, and now there's two Rogers? Szymanski wasn't so much of an employee of New Blood as he's like an associate or something. New Blood isn't structured like a traditional company. People can largely be left to their own devices depending on the game, and don't always have to answer strictly to higher-ups if they know what they're doing. The early access release of Dusk was overwhelmingly positive, which gave Szymanski and his rotating team of people aiding him a tailwind that pushed them to outdo their last efforts, which proved to fan the flames, the fan of their ambition and stress. Szymanski described the process of working on the third episode of Dusk as the most stressful point of his career. Not only did he feel like his career as a game developer was on the line, but his reputation, his connections with New Blood, and the fan expectations. Everything. He would spend many an anxious night wondering if game development was even worth all this stress, even considering returning to a Dollar General retail job at his darkest moments. He wasn't sure how to entirely transition from direct narrative horror games to a horror-themed shooter, but he pushed his anxieties to the side and finally finished his work. He wasn't developing one map, but several smaller maps for each level. His decades of playing boomer shooters was put to the ultimate test as he tirelessly slaved and put everything he had into this project. On December 10th, 2018, Dusk was finally finished and released, and we're going to take a look at it. Where to even start? Dusk is easily the most iconic game Szymanski's ever made. It kind of speaks for itself. Even if you haven't played it, you have at least heard of it if you clicked on the video. Well, let's just temper expectations. When I say it's a boomer shooter, what exactly are you picturing? It will likely depend on your age. The boomers in question, people born in the 80s and early 90s, who aren't boomers at all, but whatever, would have grown up playing Wolfenstein, Doom, maybe some Serious Sam if they're enlightened. You're rooted to the ground and there's very little reloading. Simple graphics, minimal story, rivet guns, the works. If you're younger and born in the 2000s like me, or even the 2010s, boomer shooter conjures images of people zipping across the screen with some kind of overwhelming art style, like a so retro style or some kind of intense cell shading, whatever, trying to replicate a bygone era while still keeping a distinct identity. These boomer shooters are often confused with movement shooters, those kinds of ADHD games where you need to snort a line to play optimally. The best reason why there are two unofficial definitions with overlap and confusion and subgenres is because Dusk was such a monumental, overwhelming success that it basically caused the boomer shooter genre not only to be revived, but turn into something entirely new. The way we talk about boomer shooters was kind of created by Dusk, among games like Doom 2016 and Devil Daggers, that is. Dusk doesn't so much wear its heart on its sleeve as it fashioned a coat of many colors that's always on display. All at once, it's Doom, Blood, Stalker. Nearly every 90s shooter and beyond received a love letter in the form of one of the biggest shooter games in the entire decade that revived and altered a genre forever. I mean, look at the guy you play as, Dusk Dude, an unnamed treasure hunter wandering to the town of Dusk, Pennsylvania, which has undergone a cult-like indoctrination with some kind of Lovecraftian religion that's turned its people insane and into monsters. So hold no guilt as you mow them down with your wide array of weaponry. Your standard melee weapon, pistol, shotty, SMG, all the classic hallmarks are here, but with some twists. You get to dual-wield shotguns, but you get the classic double shotty, which both take the same ammunition. You need to determine when to use a close-range, more powerful shot, or when to keep your distance and add some range. You don't run around arenas so much as you fly off your feet at a moment's notice, but with some exceptionally tight controls. B-hopping isn't just possible, it's encouraged. Dusk is as fast-paced shooters got back then. The arenas are spacious and wide, full of little objects to bounce off of and enemies to fill with lead, or like whatever's in the crossbow. Dusk paved the way for these modern movement shooters by being incredibly fast, but still entirely reasonable to control without giving you a carpal tunnel. It's like Doom 2016 on Fent. The main strategy is to zip around the world and determine when the best time to pull out a specific weapon is. Something that's so easy to determine, you really don't need much of a tutorial to do that. A weapon will spawn, give you an easy kill that informs you of its optimal use, and then you're off to the races to experiment and figure out from there. And if you don't, you die. Hope you take advantage of that luxurious save anywhere you want system the 90s shooters loved so much, which was very much so a luxury for Szymanski's games. Dusk is sort of where that low poly visual style of his games became consistent. Voxel or low fidelity graphics were something around in older titles, but from this point on, it's become the near standard. It's not hard to see why. Much easier to model something in 3D if it requires less polygons, right? I don't think Dusk is something that particularly influenced every indie dev under the sun to replicate this style, but it is what most likely make 99% of Szymanski's games doing so forward. Dusk is also a huge departure sonically. Szymanski's composition ability has been the primary driving factor in all of his games sonically prior, and since, but Dusk was primarily composed by Andrew Hulshult, one of the founders of New Blood. Dusk has a hard industrial metal soundtrack interspersed with some groaning ambient tracks. The weepy, dramatic stings and shrieks of Szymanski's ambience is sometimes found, but the pangs and groans of Hulshult's industrial sound are on all display, and I have some mixed feelings on it. The high-octane themes of carnage that play during gameplay are fantastic little deadly doo-wops that Mick Gordon would be proud of. But the softer ambient tracks are okay. They don't feel memorable or distinct in a way that really stands out for these kinds of tracks. I couldn't tell you what instruments are used or sampled, nor the individual vibe each area has. It all blends together, and you could convince me it was just one repeating track the entire time without changes. Being so evidently inspired by the shooters of old comes with a particular kind of level design. A lot of your time is spent searching for colored keys to unlock doors. The levels in Dusk are far shorter than Doom 2016. But those moments of searching for keys in a winding level with multiple offshoot paths you can explore how you please gives you plenty of time to calm down between bits of absolute carnage. You're given time to breathe, maybe rethink a strategy if you're taking too much damage. The levels themselves take on this gloomy urban countryside vibe mixed with ancient underground ruins and catacombs. It's a wonderfully rustic environment that combines the games Szymanski cherished so much while still feeling distinct and memorable with its unique art style that looks entirely its own. Me being me, I still fumbled around looking for keys for way longer than I should have, but I've played far more confusing games than this. Oh, the secrets! The secrets! You will absolutely stumble across at least one secret in every level, which is a good sign of how well they're placed. Finding a tiny reserve of health or ammo is immensely satisfying, even more so when you find secrets within secrets. The average combat encounter goes like this. All of your enemies pop out. Each one is extremely distinct, so you can tell the difference after you're introduced to them. These wizards shoot fireballs, the oxen shoot tiny projectiles that are way too tiny to see, but you still can take them out easily. The scarecrows will shred your health and armor bars if you get too close to them with your shotties. You need to determine how to give yourself space from the scarecrows, but not too much space so you eat all the projectiles from the other foes. You can dodge and weave between everyone, use your shotties, or back up all the way and pick off more troubling foes with the machine gun or the hunting rifle, all while balancing your ammo count. This can all be pulled off without much time to actively stop and think about it. You're always in the heat of the moment and can make those split-second decisions because everything is lightning fast and has very little end lag or buffering. Weapon switching is quick, you're incredibly fast, attacks are telegraphed before performed on your foes. It all combines for a pulse-pounding experience with minimal frustration. Well, I did say minimal, not none. Dusk is not perfect. There are things I personally dislike about the game, but also design choices that baffle me. There are some minor things, like some of the projectiles being so small I can hardly see them, or key locations can be kind of obtuse. But then there are swaths of the game that just outright irritate me. There are a lot of segments where your flashlight breaks and you're forced to navigate these danked, cramped areas with zero to minimal combat encounters in a pseudo-horror fashion, like Doom 3. Doom 3 is already the most divisive video game of all time, and I like Doom 3, but I really didn't care for all the times I had to stop fighting and snake through a cave with no light and do very minor platforming or puzzle solving that I felt added nothing to the experience. There was plenty of time to decompress from combat, and the horror elements are apparent in like the cultists you kill, the environments. It was all fine, so I really don't know why there were so many of these moments in later episodes. However, there is one horror element of Dusk that really stands out. I'll let it speak for itself. These guys are the Wendigos. They're invisible until you hit them. It's like a jump scare center instead of a dramatic build-up exterior. It is a fantastic bit of audio-visual design that keeps you on your toes, or filters you. Dusk does have a story, but it is very out of the way and not really important. It's something you need to go actively out of your way to piece together, in another bid to emulate how the narratives of games like Doom were there, but didn't really define the intended experience. Dusk Dude has kind of a backstory, and there are some deepest lore details, but really, it's for people who want to engage with the game theory video. Knowing the deepest lore is cool, but it doesn't help you to figure out how to aim with the hunting rifle. So we have our standard FPS guns, but we do have a collection of more unique ones too. Grenade launcher that does exactly what you'd expect, rivet launcher that does a stupid amount of damage for how plentiful the ammo is, and I'm sorry, but I don't like the crossbow. Shooting through walls is cool, but it feels very weak and not satisfying to use. Nothing tops the Half-Life 2 crossbow.
You did me
It's a very functional and fun arsenal, but it does feel a touch plain to me as someone who's played a lot of FPS games. I'm sure others would disagree, but there isn't a kind of gradual transition to the more unique in-setting weaponry. Like, there's no moment where you pick up the laser gun or the cannon in Serious Sam. Not so much a real flaw, but a taste and preference. I also found this game to definitely be on the easy side of FPS games, so it's very accessible to newbies of the genre. But for more seasoned players like myself, I recommend the higher difficulty options. I don't want to explain every facet of the game because it's something that deserves to be experienced firsthand. It goes on sale for like $7 every year. You really don't have an excuse not to have at least tried it. It's not just a great imitation and love letter to the shooters of old, but an excellent game in its own right that has a unique identity, a bridge between the old and the new frontier it helped to create. It sidesteps a few of the familiar themes of the previous games, but they aren't abandoned. Rather, you can find traces and hints of what once was all throughout. Dusk was the only game of his I had played prior to this project, but I feel substantially more satisfied knowing where Szymanski was coming from, to see his evolution and progress as a developer up until this point. Easily, far and away, Szymanski's best work up to this point, and currently, the very top of the list. I can't recommend it enough. The success of Dusk was a unique experience for the now seasoned game developer. He spent more than a couple of months on not just a single project, but a dream project that was always in his mind for over a decade. It's unfortunately not a feeling everyone can relate to, but to those who can, it's unmatched. Not just that something you put a tremendous amount of time and effort into is succeeding and becoming popular and profitable, it feels spiritually enriching. It was unlike anything he had done previously, which felt a little terrifying to him, but he was glad he did it. As far as I know, Dusk's online component was kinda dead on arrival, which is unfortunate. Even the dreariest of shooters can make for a decent deathmatch experience. I did manage to find a guy in a server and we played a 1v1 for around 15 minutes. Smoked him pretty hard and couldn't get chat to work for some reason, but if you're out there, Intruder458, thank you. I wish we got to hang out more. If you want to play this mode, you really need a small group of friends to plan things out with, or get real comfortable with the empty serverless screen. Dusk wasn't just a one and done. The game still gets updates to this day as of recording. Additional modes, workshop support, they even gave it an HD facelift completely for free in 2023. Dusk started out to decent sales, but never really petered out, making it one of New Blood's most iconic and profitable games. As far as the internet was considered, he was game dev royalty. New Blood would quickly soar as one of the most profitable and popular publishers online, but there was still an added bonus. Szymanski was a free man. Dusk was a New Blood published game, but he was still able to do whatever he pleased on his own. New Blood didn't own him. Dusk gave him a lot more fame and a lot more money to play with. People began to pay attention to him, far more than before. His name had influence, clout. He had become a household name overnight. He started appearing in podcasts and interviews, which is where I got most of my information about his life from. Dusk was kind of a gamble in his eyes, or at least a detour or experiment, and it worked out tremendously. From here, he had his hand in many pies, so giving an exact linear timeline of events won't be as cut and dry, but what we do know is that he began working on his next game not long after Dusk finished completion. Like, nothing happened. Szymanski returned to his more traditional format of shorter, more concentrated horror experiences made in less time, but kept all the lessons and experience he had learned from Dusk. What form that particularly released game would take is kinda up in the air, but one thing is certain, you probably couldn't predict what he decided to do with his next game, or games, in this context. DreadX is a horror publisher with a specific focus on indie titles. They're known for games like Dread Delusion and My Friendly Neighborhood, which was actually created by Szymanski's two brothers, John and Evan. Oh yeah, did I mention that? There are 3 Szymanski brothers, and they all make games together. It's kind of cute. But they first publicly worked together in the DreadX collections, which compiled several bite-sized games into an affordable package. with many of these games becoming full releases later down the line, and some larger creators like Erdorf, the creator of Faith, getting his foot in the door here. Szymanski was but one of these creators featured in 2 of these compilations, the first one released in 2020 and the second one also released in 2020. DreadX Collection 1 is a simple .exe file that launches other .exe files when you click on the creator's respective icon, and Szymanski's contribution was a game called The Pony Factory, a much more horror-focused shooter game that could be completed in around 15 minutes. You play as a guy roaming around in the Pony Factory, some kind of demonic factory where it turns innocent people into equine monstrosities in order to take over the world. You're tasked with finding something in the heart of the factory, then escaping with your life. The game is almost entirely black and white, with blood being the only real change in hue all throughout. Where this game excels is lighting. There is some phenomenal use of it that far exceeded what Dust was able to do. It's extremely hard to see your surroundings, so you need to use your flashlight basically everywhere to see what's in front of you, but you have to swap the flashlight out with the only gun in the game. But that gun gives you brief blinks of light when you shoot it. The ponies you have to kill are all very hard to see, so every encounter needs to be carefully planned to balance light, health, and ammo. It is a much more tremendous example of Doom 3 inspiration than Dusk ever had. It's far and away the best aspect of the game. However, this is where my praises end. The actual combat, while being somewhat fun because of all the balancing work, becomes repetitive and monotonous almost immediately. There are only 2 types of ponies, ones that charge at you and projectile types. And the projectiles, I think they're hit scan? So you have to duck around the walls in order to avoid it, which makes every encounter less of a test of wits and practice, and more of a procedural cover shooter, something I don't think aids Szymanski's style at all. The ponies themselves are very flat encounters because their pathfinding is somewhat, lacking. They run right into walls more often than not, so using your gun to nail them to the ground is a very pedestrian task. Hunting resources is a crucial aspect because health and ammo deplete within an instant. There is more than enough to drown in, especially for ammo, but it kind of boils down to personal preference if you like this or not. If you like constantly running out of both, hunting to get them back up, then having just enough bullets to clear the room, then you will like this game more than I did. And if you somehow can't find any or they're all gone, well, at that point, just die. It takes about 10 minutes to find the thing you're looking for, but you have to go through the entire facility backwards to leave, which feels like a sour note to end on, especially for me, since Dusk had such a wonderfully winding level design that made backtracking fun because of additional pathways and secrets, which are nowhere to be found in this demo. But I mean, I guess that makes sense, it's a demo. The only way a game's capable of ramping up the difficulty here is by throwing more ponies at you in a single room, which means combat encounters are just running backwards to kill the charging ones, then duck for cover at the projectile ponies. I enjoyed the style and vibes of this game well enough for what it was, but it felt like a much more unimpressive showing for a shooter game. It's not like it's illegal for a creator to make an intentionally smaller and less ambitious project after what many people would consider their master stroke, but it is an odd choice. Worry not, because a mere couple of months later, DreadX Collection 2 would drop, and it came with a bevy of upgrades. Instead of a static menu, there's a whole 3D environment with a mini story attached to it that I promptly ignored.
That should be enough to jumpstart your natural neural defense mechanisms. In normal circumstances, we'd be able to just...
Squirrel Stapler is the next game featured, and it's wildly different from anything Szymanski's made in quite some time. From looks alone, that's evident. For once, it's daytime and the vibe's quite chill and laid back, despite you playing as a guy with his dead wife stapled to the wall. Squirrel Stapler is a hunting game where the objective is to, as you'd imagine, hunt squirrels. Gone are the fast-paced, arcadey action segments. This is a game that demands precision and patience, because hunting requires keen eyes and open ears. You're equipped with nothing more than your senses and a hunting rifle, which can be restocked at a number of designated stations around the surprisingly large map. You can easily spend well over an hour exploring the map as you casually hunt for these little critters, taking some great care to respect your sound of your footsteps. But the horror aspects are largely found in the overall surrealism. Your wife being nailed to a wall is one thing, but the actual use for these squirrels is to staple them to her corpse, to do something. Also, apparently God is coming in 5 days? There's 5 days of hunting, with the challenges required to complete each day gradually ramping up from collecting 5 squirrels to hunting 1 larger squirrel in addition to encounters with some kind of ghost and beyond. The build-up for the surrealism is shockingly well orchestrated and thrilling. I felt excited to move on to the next day, as long as I found the squirrels in a reasonable amount of time, which is kind of up in the air. The whole game felt like a dark parody of hunting simulators, a really refreshing style that completely nails the vibe it was going for. I'll be leaving these 2 games off the tier list for now, because they were merely demos for future expanded releases. Szymanski enjoyed the Dread X collection format so much he even produced the 4th one. He handpicked all of the entries, as well as composing the music found in the hub area. His only stipulations were that all the games had to be shooters in some sense. Other than that, he was very hands-off with the whole process. He also made Dusk 82 a year later, which a lot of people thought was a joke, but no. Dusk 82 is its very own puzzle demake of Dusk, set as a kind of prequel. It's a turn-based retro-style game where you have a limited amount of turns to use for moving objects or blasting things with your shoddy, with the objective being to solve minor puzzles and reach the end goal for each stage. Some might argue it's more of a companion piece to Dusk than a game that can stand on its own, which is kind of true, but it's a very charming game that I honestly enjoyed more than a lot of the earlier titles, despite my short playtime. There's a full level editor and workshop support. This wasn't just a piece of abandonware, it's actually one of Szymanski's favorite games. Something I couldn't help but notice as I played is how similar this game is to one of his first games, Spy, made with QBasic. I guess he really liked Sokoban. Not that I blame him. I will say, Szymanski started to learn how much weight his name and Dusk's name carried, because Dusk 82 is one of his most expensive games, like more expensive than his other fully fleshed out titles that would release later. But was he really spending an entire year crafting this? No, he was not. The 2020s are a very interesting decade for Szymanski, because while he bit his time with making very short demos for Dread X and releasing Dusk 82, he was cooking. There was a new set of expectations. Rather than just making a new game, this was the developer of Dusk's next game. It carries significant weight and perhaps the potential consequence of people saying, "You peaked early." This was his OK Computer. What would his next step be? To try and lean even harder into the shooter genre and risk becoming formulaic and stale? Or make a dramatic left turn and risk alienating a core audience? The Dread X collection games had the benefits of being obvious demos, and Dusk 82, regardless of how people interpret it, was a Dusk side game. It exists under Dusk's shadow because it's a prequel demake, but not a separated original title. What would be the next Steam release? 2022 was Szymanski's most active, experimental, and defining year as a game developer. He released, or at least aided in the release of not 1, not 2, but 3 separate, distinct games that are all vastly different from each other. One was a traditionally made bite-sized project, the second was far more time-tested and careful, and the other a collaboration with a familiar face. Let's talk about game number 1, Iron Lung, released on the 10th of March, 2022. An endless ocean of blood, the last breaths of a dying world, being completely, utterly, and unequivocally alone. This is what constitutes the entirety of Iron Lung, but it's far more impressive than the sum of its parts. From the moment you lay eyes on the expansive ocean of murky blood, any expectations of adventure or frivolity are drowned before your eyes. Iron Lung is a dark game, and I mean that literally. Things are hardly illuminated, your environment is hard to see. The dim lights of the submarine you inhabit are your only relief from the constant, oppressive claustrophobia present at all times. Some time ago, an event dubbed the Quiet Rapture resulted in the total vanishing of not only almost every human being, but every habitable planet in the known galaxy, leaving humanity in the triple digits as it desperately clings to life on various scattered moons. You play as a prisoner tasked with exploring a blood ocean, but potential resources that could determine the survival of the species. Iron Lung is an oppressive, depressive, and miserable world full of tales of violence and the most monstrous form of isolation Szymanski has ever penned. You can almost taste the desperation of our species as you play the game. The fact that humanity has become nearly extinct in a seemingly universal vanishing of life is still somehow tantamount to our smaller scale task of exploration. The name of the game describes our submarine: claustrophobic, hazy, and bleak. The iron lung was an infamous device that people would spend their entire lives in to keep their lungs pumping, an echo of a bygone era thanks to modern medicine. Humanity being so thoroughly decimated kind of reverted them to a more primitive state, despite the massive technological advancements, something evoked in naming the machine after such a primitive tool. People are superstitious and afraid, getting into petty conflicts with each other and unsure how to deal with the impending extinction. Thalassophobia is the fear of the ocean and other comparably deep bodies of water, something people have been very vocal about online. Just searching up the term brings up images of submerged ships and structures, of a man sinking to the bottom of the ocean with no hope of survival, and Iron Lung is a masterclass example of this phobia. The constant burbling and groans of the ocean in your sub are ever present. You literally cannot see the ocean of blood as you pilot it, your only indicators of where you are being the radar to detect walls, and the photos you're required to take, which is our actual in-game objective. Only a fraction of this ocean has been mapped out, which makes the entire piloting experience a laborious and dangerous task, because our only controls are 2 arrows and a drag function. You feel like a toddler swept out to a sea, with minimal control over yourself in an especially dreadful way. The pictures you take of the ocean are staggering. They're monochrome and depict objects and structures not found on Earth. You can hardly tell what anything is supposed to be. It's a constant reminder of how alone you are on this alien moon as you drift away from your predetermined denotions on the map. You have an oxygen meter that continually runs out the more you progress, adding that much more of a fire under your ass to keep moving. Iron Lung is a shockingly simple game. The only real objective here is to engage with the submarine controls, a fire extinguisher, a terminal input, and the camera. That's it. It's one of the most minimalist games Szymanski's ever made, but it hardly feels like it because of the jaw-dropping fine-tuning and polish present in what little we have to chew on. The sound design is especially gorgeous. Every blurb of the sea and every groan of your rusty submarine is quiet and distant, but also omnipresent, a constant, roaring reminder of your situation and the hopelessness it entails. The whole game has a very SCP vibe to it, but with playing as an unnamed prisoner doing dangerous dirty work for the sake of science. The logs in your computer you can access feel like reading an abridged article as well, with only bits and pieces of what feels like an expanse of lore we don't get to fully immerse ourselves in because of our status, which has its ups and downs. The game's setting feels totally in line with what we know about the background information, but I never quite settled comfortably with all the redacted segments, even on vanilla SCP articles. It always felt like a shorthand to escape from having to explain anything or get into the real nitty-gritty of a concept, which is largely more of a preference for me. This is head and shoulders Szymanski's strongest work as a composer. I've always enjoyed his little ambient tracks, but Iron Lungs are monumentally his best work, bar none. 10 out of 10, excellent. It channels the haunting droning of Akira Yamaoka's Silent Hill tracks and the threatening dread of Postal 1's loading screens. Just an excellent, perfect track list that ensnares you into such a violently lonely world. With all of this considered, Iron Lung is a very short but decadently jam-packed and immersive exploration game with a dead simple task, but at a deadly cost. Now, what do I actually think of it? Well, there's no real easy way to say it, but Iron Lung was kind of exhausting to play, like tremendously exasperating and tedious. Controlling the sub is a really stale experience because there's only 3 buttons, so you're holding your mouse to match the coordinates laid out and messing with the drag to not slam into a wall, which is basically all you will do, especially at the beginning. Seriously, the amount of walls I slammed into, it made me feel like I was exploring some guy's house rather than the ocean. You stand totally still and just keep your gaze fixated on this interface until you reach the coordinates laid out for you. Then you take your picture of whatever. The experience is extremely reliant on you being terrified the entire time, which just wasn't the case for me. It's not that I don't find the concept personally scary or the game somehow not immersive, but the thalassophobia concept just doesn't really get under my skin, if that makes sense. Not that I'd ever want to do this in real life, but my brain just doesn't really register the concept to make me afraid while I'm playing this. So you're pedaling around in the dark and you occasionally stop to take photos. It's like a blend of Aquanaut's Holiday and Pokemon Snap, which is fine, but I couldn't help feel like the end was a little predictable. Because the last picture is a monster that knows you're there. What else was it going to be? Being predictable is not inherently a bad thing, but it did sort of throw a monkey wrench for me when the entire game is built around not being able to see your environment very well, and you can predict exactly why and when the twist is going to happen. It depends on the person to find that build-up enticing, but it kind of fell flat for me. So I spent more time than I cared to admit aimlessly drifting around to either find the predetermined coordinates or look for secrets in the Blood Ocean, to which there are a few, but those are very few and far between, so a lot of time is spent around looking for the fun, which I didn't find any personal satisfaction in. The photos you do see are so vague that you could say it's part of a building or another sub, or some guy's Honda Civic. It doesn't really matter. The core gameplay loop of Iron Lung just didn't sit well for me. I found it tedious and dull and not something I felt excited to engage with, despite the wonderful ambience. Perhaps I'm alone in this feeling, but I feel like Iron Lung was one of the weaker games I played, which justifies its place towards the lower end of my list. I know many people will find that contentious, but if I weren't being truthful, then what would I be? I really don't know what to say, it just didn't settle with me. I would be remiss if I didn't use Iron Lung as a sort of checkpoint to see how far Szymanski's come as a developer, however. Simply comparing the kind of isolation found in Figure Bones to Iron Lung is staggering. These might not seem like similar games at all, but they share more common DNA than you'd think, and I'm not referring to both of them being Unity games. Even though I didn't like Iron Lung, a lot of people really loved Iron Lung. It got picked up on YouTube completely, unlike Szymanski's other projects, becoming something of a darling in the indie horror scene thanks to countless Let's Plays and essayists, and it's not hard to see why. Watching someone else play Iron Lung is comparable, maybe even more enjoyable than actually playing the game on its own. You get all the ambience and atmosphere and the fun jump scare at the end, but with very little to none of the frustration and boredom of actually controlling the submarine yourself. It's a very digestible game to explain to someone. The horror of the ocean depths, the cameras, it all makes sense in a couple sentences, and combined with a very short runtime, it's no surprise the coverage of the game became mainstream in a very short amount of time, rivaling Dusk as Szymanski's most documented and arguably famous game ever. Online coverage of indie games is a huge reason why they blow up, and since Iron Lung was so easy to make a Let's Play for and required basically no prior context or backstory, you can easily watch Markiplier play this and become a fan of the game without having ever played it yourself. Keep Markiplier's name in mind, by the way. However, there is a darker reason why Iron Lung exploded in popularity, and it was something that no one could have predicted. On June 18th, 2023, a submersible underwater vehicle meant to explore the ruins of the infamous Titanic cruise ship suffered a fatal accident. It imploded. It's a very complicated topic that others have done a much better job at summarizing and explaining, but due to exceptionally poor planning by the team inside the vehicle, everyone was crushed inside of the sub in a fraction of a second. All 5 occupants were unable to process the fact their lives would end shortly as the ocean depth imploded. This was all over the internet for quite a while, and mere days after the event was reported on, Szymanski would update his Twitter account with news that this event had dramatically spiked sales of Iron Lung unlike anything he had ever seen. Szymanski capitalized on this in a very specific way. He decided to raise the price by $2, from $6 to $8 American. Many people felt annoyed at his decision to take advantage of the new rush of people flocking to Iron Lung, but he clarified that he is and always has been a game developer for profit, and that if the decision offended them so much, they could simply refund the game or pirate it. I suppose it depends on the individual how they feel about all this. I do admire his gusto in saying he simply just doesn't care about piracy, even kind of tacitly encouraging it if they so disagree with his decision, but raising prices, even from $6 to $8, which is quite paltry, is still a decision to raise prices in the face of something happening in world news that made his game more relevant. Szymanski was still not done with 2022. Iron Lung came out in March, but he and a familiar face were working on something in the meantime, something released in early access on the 5th of September, Gloomwood. Gloomwood was the hardest game to mention in this video for several reasons. The first one being that it's still in early access, which means it's nowhere near being finished. Secondly, the game is, or at least was, a collaborative work. Dylan Rogers, the New Blood employee, was working on Gloomwood for quite a while, far back enough to be developed alongside Dusk. I mentioned the two became friends and Dylan helped with Dusk's development, but that connection led to Szymanski helping Dylan on his personal project, which finally got an early access release only a couple months after Iron Lung, which is all the more impressive when you realize how splendidly in-depth Gloomwood is. Gloomwood is not a boomer shooter or a 30-minute thriller. It is a developing immersive sim game with a jaw-dropping commitment to atmosphere and high quality. Immersive sim is kind of a metal definition, but the best way I've seen it described is a genre that emphasizes player choice and expression within the game's many overlapping mechanics and systems. Let me put it in a way everyone understands. You have to get around a guy somehow. You can do it stealthily and not alert him at all, or just blow his brains out. The most famous immersive sim games are titles like Deus Ex and System Shock, and Gloomwood runs with the concepts they form. It's a really vague, broad definition, but it's easier to define one by pointing at specific titles rather than getting into the nitty-gritty. You play as an unnamed doctor gallivanting through a filthy, depraved city inspired by Victorian England. From the very moment you're given control over the character, you wear a ring that glows to determine if you're able to be seen or heard by the enemies, currently these Plague Doctor guys. My experience with the immersive sim genre is limited to only a few titles, mainly Dishonored 1, a bit of Thief, and depending on who you ask, Postal 2 is an immersive sim. But even with my relatively limited experience, Gloomwood not only follows in the steps of its forebearers, it does do a lot to stand out uncontested. Stealth is to be expected in a game like this, and it settles somewhere unkindly between Thief and maybe Bioshock, where you can sneak around if you so desire, but I found the most comfortable way to play was just hiding in the dark until you can secure a backstab insta-kill. So you're playing everyone's first Skyrim playthrough, but as the spy. That isn't to say there aren't more options for weapons, however. You have several firearms and some destructible barrels to play with. Combat outside of the backstab does feel somewhat clunky to me. We have a block and a swing, which work well enough, but I personally found the carefully timed dance of swinging while also finding time to block your foe's axes cumbersome and not entirely fine-tuned. These Plague Doctor guys are a little at odds with their awareness. They are capable of peeking you when they think you're safe on the chains in the hallways to shoot you with their rifles, but also dumb enough not to notice you bumping into them. They have color-coded lights to broadcast how aware of you they are, but also feel the need to verbally grumble about being able to spot you or not. It's not that these are poorly made encounters, far from it, but I don't think they stand anywhere near the best examples of beginning level enemy AI like those found in Fear, Condemned, or Thief. They kind of feel like a modded Bethesda encounter, so there's really no need to move bodies around, even if you're clearly meant to. These guys are small fry, and a lot of the enemies further on feel like it as well. Sound is something that mostly works in the immediate sense. Rifle shots are basically self-contained to the rooms they were fired in, so if you mess up and get shot, the guy's buddy has basically no idea what just happened half the time if you manage to brute force kill them. Using firearms is something to be done cautiously. Not just because the sound they emit will attract more overwhelming foes, I mean sometimes it's kind of inconsistent, but because the ammo is scarce, in theory, and reloading and keeping track of bullets has to be done manually. There's little to no on-screen UI, making every combat encounter feel extremely tense. It makes me feel like you're gonna get me in real life if I fail. Your inventory seems to be a genuine physical prop you have to carefully pull out. Because it doesn't function as a pause screen, the game still runs, which means you need to find a safe place to manage your extremely limited space, which for me mostly consisted of bottles I can throw at people. The city you explore is nothing short of resplendent in how vile it looks. Everything is rotting, filled with corpses, or people who will still become corpses. It's a miserable environment that really captures the average lifestyle of a Brit. The menus are all notepads and sketchbook pages, with anatomy drawings, which makes sense given the player's occupation. You feel completely grounded and like a minor, insignificant part of this frightening world, which makes wanting to explore its vast canals and treacherous buildings all the more satisfying and death-defying. Dylan has a lot of experience messing with Source Engine games and Hammer, so those who played a lot of Valve games might feel a bit of Half-Life's DNA. Something that I can't fully explain, but something about the intro level just screamed Half-Life 2 to me. Maybe it's all the rooftop jumping. As much as I like these locations, they are somewhat disappointingly linear. Currently, killing guards and stealing keys is basically the only way to progress. There aren't a lot of hidden paths or intended sequence-breaking sections to make you feel clever. You really have to go on the few paths the game wants you to, which are all doors placed slightly farther from each other to lead to different sides of the same building. I think some Prey-esque deviation in choosing our path was in order, but who knows what the future holds. The save system low-key makes me want to die. There's no quick saving. You have determined save points with these phonographs, which was something of a mixed bag for me. The maps are phenomenally well designed and place locked doors and gates around these save points to loop back to when you progress further, but it does come with the caveat of having you lose progress with every death. This could be 5 minutes of progress or half hour. Something which can come quite easy when you get mauled by a foe you can't even see and you die right away, because telling exactly how much health you have at any given moment can be kind of tough due to how subtle the indication is. Keep in mind, I played this on the standard difficulty. I couldn't imagine how much more frustrating everything else is while playing on the hardest option. Gloomwood is easily my favorite game on this video visual-wise. It divorces itself more than enough from the tired retro PSX style that everyone insists on using, and doesn't entirely land on the retro PS2 style either. It's really its own beast. It's definitely low poly, but to me it settles past most PlayStation 2 games and a little below PS3, like a fictional bridge console that never existed. PS2.5, if you will. I think there's a story here. That part isn't really being fleshed out. When I say this is an early access game, I don't mean Dusk sense where it's being developed in the coming months, but rather in a very rudimentary sense. Gloomwood in its current state is essentially a vertical slice rather than just a demo or chunk of the game. This is an exceptionally polished early access with very few bugs, for the most part, but there's clearly a lot missing from a hypothetical final release here. More areas, details, polishing, mechanics. Everything I complained about you should take with a grain of salt, because it's more than likely it will be addressed, if not fixed or modified entirely. Sure, opinions will vary from mine, but I rank Gloomwood somewhere in the middle of this tier list as a very promising game, but leaves something to be desired because it is not a finished game in any capacity. I really can't imagine this game getting any worse with further updates, however. What we do have is still pretty damn good. Now, how much of this game was Dylan Rogers and how much was Szymanski? Well, people have asked before, and it seems like a mostly Dylan-based project, but Szymanski contributed not insignificantly to the 3D modeling, map design, asset creation, basically anything that wasn't programming the game. He downplays his involvement by saying he stopped actively developing the game around its Market District update and is more of a supervisor, but he did still do enough to earn the co-developer label on Steam. The Market update came out around mid-2023, so as of now, Szymanski isn't working on the game actively, I think, but who knows what will change. I do have a lot to say about the game, but I'm very hesitant to critique it further because of the fact it clearly isn't fully released. I still feel what we do have of Gloomwood is worthy enough to be placed where it is, and when the game is fully released, it's going to be a very different beast. And I'm excited. Much of my impressions were from the first two areas, because more areas are gradually being released over time, but this is the largest game Szymanski's ever worked on, bar none. A multi-hour immersive sim game that basically no one knows how long will be once it's fully completed. There are plenty of first impressions and reviews for its initial release, but basically everyone who likes this game is waiting for a full release. The price is around 20-something Canadian dollars, which might change upon full release, but I certainly didn't feel ripped off with this price point whatsoever. I'd love to wait for the game to be finished to review it in its entirety, but who knows if I'll still be making videos in the year 2048. After releasing one of the most booming games in the indie horror scene ever earlier that year, then being a core figure in the upcoming release of one of the most impressive indie immersive sim games ever, the man had what you could call an absurdly busy schedule. He held many spinning dishes at once, and his next release was just around the corner. Consider what he had done in the last 2 years. 2 demos, full game, then contributing to another massive game. He was sitting on the Pony Factory and Squirrel Stapler, so you'd expect one of those games to be polished enough for a full release, right? Chop Goblins was released in December 12th. Rather than polish the previous titles for full release, he was lying in bed one day when he thought, what if there were Chop Goblins?
And I was like half asleep, and just suddenly the name, like the idea of like Chop Goblins came into my head of like this is like a schlock 80s series, and there would have to be like, 8 of them or something.
This idea completely overtook the end of 2022 for him, and he spent an extremely short amount of time making the game, which might sound confusing and kind of troublesome, but it does make sense if you know how he makes his games. He's spoken about being diagnosed with a form of ADHD, so some ideas become major fixations for him within a short period of time and completely overshadow others, which can be seen quite clearly in his release schedule. The 80s cheap film aesthetic is felt as soon as you load into the game. Chop Goblins prides itself on being a video game representation of said awful film, and it soars in this aspect. The entire game is a very light dithering effect meant to replicate a VHS film in a way that's not nearly as intrusive as a lot of other games aping it. The colors are often blinding in their vibrancy, but used sparingly enough not to cause me to go blind. The game describes itself as a micro-shooter, fully advertising its short length and quick gameplay style. The best way I could advertise it is by saying it's a vertical slice of a classic shooter game that doesn't exist. The story is incredibly slim, existing mostly as loading screens. The year is 1984. You play as some random guy who stumbles across the ancient tomb of the Chop Goblins in a museum, and you have to kill them all before they chop down the buildings. Our weaponry feels like it was chosen at random, and I mean that in the best way possible. A dagger, a flintlock pistol, 2 different kinds of stake launchers, a magic wand, and a shotgun I'm pretty sure I missed. The flintlock pistol is basically the revolver from Half-Life. The first stake gun is the shotty from Serious Sam 2, the other stake launcher honestly kind of sucks and feels like a really flimsy SMG, and the wand is basically a grenade launcher that can chain these electric coils to instantly jib enemies. All of these weapons can be used alongside the dagger with the right mouse button by pressing E. Combined with basically non-existent end lag, we have ourselves an exceptionally fast-paced shooter game. The combat might sound simple, and it is, but there is depth to it. You can reflect projectiles with the dagger, which can be upgraded to become laughably overpowered. There are a lot of surprising little tips and tricks to slaughter the goblins however you feel like. I enjoy the lightning fast sting of a flintlock shot to dagger hit. It kills almost everything in the game. The levels are all over the place. A city, ancient Greece, Dracula's castle. Every aspect of Chop Goblins was just some random idea Szymanski felt like including. And that's really the main draw of the game. A seasoned shooter fan and creator makes an arcadey shooter is the draw here, and it delivers. For the most part. My biggest issue was the lack of mobility. You are totally rooted to the ground with one exception in the Grease level. It's not that you can't fly around like Dusk, you can't even jump. Most of his other games operate like this, but Scroll Stapler does not require that whatsoever, and even Pony Factory felt playable without it given the intentionally cramped nature of the map. But Chop Goblins feels like a game I should be able to at least hop around in, even if it's not the absurd bee-hopping like Dusk. I suppose it was made to feel intentionally different, which I totally understand, but I still think it's odd that a game pitched as a thrilling action shooter has you rooted to the ground. The goblins themselves are really damn charming. They speak in these hilariously pitched up tones that make me chuckle every time I blew their brains out. Chop Goblins is junk food gaming. It aims to be a sweet treat every once in a while, but you probably shouldn't overindulge. It lacks basically any of the themes or story elements Szymanski typically does, but who's playing Chop Goblins for their religious undertones? I will say, it has one of the best and most varied soundtracks Szymanski has ever composed. Take a listen. Some would say Chop Goblins is one of his more forgettable projects, but I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. It goes somewhere in the middle for me. Chop Goblins closed out Szymanski's 2022, the most active I have literally ever seen a video game developer, indie or not. He definitely started taking it a bit easier afterwards, or at least released less projects. 2023 was largely a year of backlogging. That's when Dusk HD was released, Iron Lung really started to take off. There was a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes, which might spell doom for a man who releases several projects a year. But remember, there were still 2 games submitted to DreadX that were effectively being sat on. So on September 11th, 2023, the full release of Squirrel Stapler came out. I wrote the full release of Squirrel Stapler is released. I really need to proofread these scripts a bit more. I was intentionally quiet on a lot of aspects of Squirrel Stapler when I covered the version featured on the DreadX collection, and that's because during the creation of this video, Squirrel Stapler has become easily one of my favorite Szymanski games. Would you honestly believe that this is his most thematically complicated and thorough game? It's actually not that hard when you play it. The full release of this game is very similar to its original version, which can also be played on its own, as well as the Pony Factory, which means I didn't even need to buy any of the DreadX collections. But everything has been given a minor upgrade under the hood. For instance, the ambience of the forest has been elevated several fold, with all new sounds to really make you feel like you're baking under the sun hunting squirrels. There's a number of new items hidden around the map, like these sodas that give you temporary super speed. The differences are major enough to warrant purchasing this version over the initial, but this is fundamentally the same game with some touch-ups, which is all it really needed to be. The foundation was already well crafted, and it really didn't need something pointlessly thrown in there just to make it different from the original release. As you hunt these little vermin, you can scour across the map to find these little notes telling you squirrel facts, which may surprise you. There's also a shack we can visit every day to read a story about an artist painting a picture of a woman so well that he falls in love with it, like a Hick Pygmalion. Or a sin shack where we can, commit sins, however you want to interpret it. I hadn't noticed it at first, but Squirrel Stapler almost trips over itself feverishly to deliver its central theme, Christian guilt. If God is coming in 5 days is not enough of a screaming reference, there is far more than meets the eye in this forest. Our main character has scraps of some kind of furry Bible in his home talking about the black goat of the woods, and how squirrels are some kind of holy creature, while lobsters are not. We are literally haunted by ghosts for most of the game. We get whispers in the distance from a figure we can't see.
Hey, how you doing, little mama? Let me whisper in your ear.
We don't know if this main character is responsible for killing his wife, or if she died via tragic accident, but he, and by extension the player, can never shake off the feeling of constantly being watched, being judged for our every action. Some kind of animal is hunting us at the start of day 3, the looming threat of God coming scrawled into the wall. The story of the artist and his painting ends with a vicious, tragic tale of murder. There are even some military-style reports scattered around. No matter where you explore, the running motif of being observed and judged is not only present, it is baked into the very foundation of this game's DNA, down to how you have to play it. Just as you're forced to patiently monitor squirrels to shoot, the hunter we play as is a kind of proverbial squirrel being observed at all times, by ourselves and by God. Both the in-game representation and the literal observance happening as we watch this video. It may seem simple, and maybe a little drab, and perhaps even a touch melodramatic, but it was profoundly effective to me. It's done in such a tasteful and genuine way that it completely sidesteps any weepy dialogue or cliches that might come with the territory, because the game intends to be a minimalist parody of a hunting game, which it excels in with its intentionally flat and almost personalityless presentation of information through red text on the screen, and the lack of a distinct voice or expressions from its main protagonist. It feels like a blend of Silent Hill 2 mixed with the Hunting Unlimited series, an unbelievable blend of genre and stories that came from a place deep in Szymanski's heart, something only he could provide. I genuinely think from a narrative perspective, this is his strongest game. There is a frightening amount of depth for something that could be completed in an hour. The extreme isolation, Christian guilt, cultish practices are brought to an absolute zenith here. Never has his storytelling ability been stranger or more successful. I am incredibly hesitant to say everything I want to, because Squirrel Stapler has become something that really requires its own video, and I would rather not have that bleed into a different project. S tier, easily. Brothers and sisters, it's a very different game from Dusk, and I think it does fall short of being my favorite of his games by factor being a lot more repetitive and something kind of frustrating to hunt the squirrels, but it's exceptional how deep a game about stapling animals to your skinned wife is. To me, this is the game I think best represents Szymanski as a creator, Weird, dark humor, strong undercurrent of faith and guilt and loneliness, wearing its inspirations on its sleeve with its old-school shooter DNA, it being a very short, condensed experience with extreme value for the price. As much as I love Dusk, I don't think it's the best game to represent the breadth of Szymanski as a creator, perhaps because it's the best thing he's currently made, but it also lacks a lot of the trademarks he's built up through most of his other games, which is not a bad thing whatsoever, but it's just not emblematic of who I feel he is as a creative person. It's a very different game for him, something that took several years rather than something that was made within 10 months or so. It's a multi-hour campaign, something only matched by Gloomwood, which he admits was mostly a Dylan Rogers affair. Squirrel Stapler is what I recommend to play if you want to play any of his games past Dusk. I haven't even mentioned the game's ending, which is easily the most iconic part, because I'll save that for the video. If you play nothing else from this video, play this. The 19th of January 2024 brought us the full release of the Pony Factory, the last of the Dread X Collection re-releases. With Squirrel Stapler, I was deliberately keeping some information secret so I didn't have to retread too much of when I spoke of it again, but my Pony Factory coverage was pretty comprehensive enough not to fall into that trap. Stapler's new features were mostly new little Easter eggs. The core game was pretty much the same, while Pony Factory's re-release presented some new intrigues, but also challenges. The Doom 3 inspiration is still here, the map and combat are still as they were, but different enough to point out. There are around a dozen new flyers stapled around the factory we can read, which tell a slightly more detailed version of the story. Winston is the CEO of the factory, abducting townsfolk to use in experiments to turn them into horses. He runs his program like a crazy Henry Ford, with a detailed moral compass that consistently monitors its workers, lest they become sinful and end up being turned into the mutated ponies. The game is very light on story, but I did find it funny that making a deal with hell and mutating people is treated as a business transaction more than a ritual. It adds a very slight, very welcome dimension to the original adventure, which was sorely lacking. It's also funny as hell. No pun intended. You actually play as Winston's son trying to find the heart of the ponies, or like whatever it is, to succeed where his father failed, presumably meaning to raise an army of hellborn monsters. You still go through the entire factory and have to retread it once you find the heart, but the end half has been revamped with some slightly new locations and a brand new final boss, a giant pony skull that works like a janky Pac-Man, and brother, you're the pellet. It really refreshed the game and addressed some of the minor complaints I had, but the major issues I had, mainly the repetition and lackluster combat, are almost untouched. If you killed one pony, you killed them all. There's absolutely no innovation or differentiating past the flashlight, gunfire swapping. I felt it became stale right away on Dread X and has not improved here. In fact, it actually might have gotten worse. There is a new upgrade for your gun, which takes it from fully automatic to shooting at the speed of sound the longer you hold the fire button. Part of the gunplay in the original was aiming each bolt carefully because of the limited ammo. You had to plan each shot, but with this attachment it just shoots far quicker and nixes some of the challenge the original had. You can kinda just hold down fire and you usually just kill everything in your path without thinking about it. It makes the final boss a joke that's over before it really begins. This is an optional attachment, so you can skip it, but if having to omit the new content for a paid re-release is the optimal way to play it in my opinion, is that truly the mark of success, to play the game like it's an Atlas re-release? The difficulty options are strange, to say the least. They aren't laid out from easiest to hardest like literally every other game in existence does. It's all over the place. Veteran says it damages the player doubly and removes some ammo and health pickups, and Casual gives you more, as well as providing the flashlight and gun from the start. Veteran is what I played, and I found it pretty reasonably fair. Lights Out removes the flashlight entirely, which is an interesting challenge on paper, but it becomes borderline impossible to play at some points and have fun because some areas are so dark you have to fire bolts to see anything, which means you will run out exceptionally quickly, and if you're stuck in the dark with no bullets, you might as well reset the game. Iron Horse is basically Devil May Cry as hell in hell. You die in one hit. Turns out the real pony this factory was assembling was a one-trick pony. Do I recommend Pony Factory? Hell nay. It was Szymanski's least impressive shooter by quite a long margin. The vertical slice method used for Chop Goblins worked far better because there was some variety in there. I never got tired of it despite its short length, but what we do have in Pony Factory kinda just crumbles under its own weight. Take this part with a grain of salt, but Pony Factory has a weird, specific vibe of My Little Pony horror fandom, if that makes any sense. Given how many adults were into this show a decade ago, it's not entirely surprising this would be the case. The entire game feels weirdly aware of the Cupcake story and like other fandom ventures, and I know Szymanski knows about bronies and that general aspect of the internet to some extent, so I do wonder how much of this game was a kind of ironic jab directed towards them. What was up with bronies? Why did so many people obsess over these cartoon horses? While I was editing this, I did find out that John Szymanski helped David with this release, and they pushed it at the specific date they did because John was still waiting on funds from his previous work on My Friendly Neighborhood to release. So perhaps if this wasn't the case, there may have been more added or polished. It does give a fair explanation why this feels somewhat lacking in comparison to other games, and I really do sympathize. It's kind of like a Postal 4 situation. The game had to come out to make ends meet. More interesting than the game itself, however, is some of the implication the notes bring up, like this one here, detailing an account of how squirrels kept breaking into the factory and causing problems in unusually aggressive and organized fashion, which is quite the implication. There's another note detailing that Winston's unnamed son has his own company that is currently performing an observation of the spiritual nature of the nearby forest, which is being dumped full of sin, which is an actual tangible substance created in the factory. Pony Factory casually slips in not only references to Squirrel Stapler, but full-on connections. We play as the son who owns this company in the forest, which can be interpreted in a couple different ways. The reports scattered in the forest are more than likely of that in the son's company, and perhaps we even play as the same son in Squirrel Stapler, given the thematic and literal connection of God, sinning, and hell having some kind of plan with the son's conquest of the pony heart in the army. Make no mistake, these two games are clearly connected, something penned after both games were released on their own. People definitely noticed these connections, but they were background elements, something meant for hardcore players only. This would sort of tie people over for a full year, because Pony Factory was the only game Szymanski released in 2024. It wouldn't be until January 23rd, 2025, when his next game, Butcher's Creek, was released. The game was something always being worked on in the background, but not until 2 months ago as of recording was it ready to be released. So, who up butchering they creek? Wow, okay. So I just completed this game mere hours before typing out the script segment for it, and I have never felt more conflicted about a video game in a long time. My opinion of this game is constantly shifting between a great time and a frustrating lesson in missed potential. But let me explain myself. I have tried to write this segment several times, but it really deserves its own chapter division. Butcher's Creek is aiming to be a very specific type of game. A first-person melee game, to which there are more than a few: Shadow Warrior, Xenoclash, and especially Condemned Criminal Origins. Many of these games have guns in them, but there's a massive focus on melee combat, which is typically expanded upon to feature far more variety than just your basic short-range attack. Get ready for a lot of Condemned comparisons, because Butcher's Creek really wants to be what it had. There are no guns or firearms or projectiles in Butcher's Creek whatsoever. Just melee weapons. Boards of wood, hammers, axes, whatever vaguely sharp or blunt tool or object you can possibly think of being in your dad's shed is up for grabs to bash people's brains in, and the combat is built entirely around it. Every weapon has a specific amount of damage, range, durability, which can be seen as stats before picking them up. You have to constantly find new weapons, since whatever state this game takes place in won first prize in the Brittle Tools competition. The weapon durability is hardly an unreasonable thing to include, since it promotes not finding one weapon at the start to carry with you at all times. In fact, it's impossible given the durability. And there's always a pipe or pair of pliers lying around to grab or throw at a moment's notice. But the reason Condemned's system worked so well was because there was exceptional enemy AI. You couldn't just blindly swing. You had to carefully time inputs as you got up close, which depends on the weapon you have. Heavier weapons took longer, of course, while smaller ones dealt less damage but were far faster. You could parry to avoid a foe's strikes and retaliate. Butcher's Creek has all these exact systems, but like dollar store versions. Maybe it's just me, But this parry is one of the stubbiest and least helpful parries I've ever seen, ever. I find I'm hardly able to deflect anything, and I take a hit from whatever box cutter this hick has in his hands every time. Not that you need to parry. Just backing up and taking strikes every so often is a strategy that will 100% work every single time with zero drawbacks whatsoever. This couldn't be done all the time in Condemn because foes were smart and would pursue you faster and even try and flank you. The AI in Butcher's Creek is not smart. None of the cleverness or map knowledge or strategies the crazies in Condemned have are here. They get stuck on basic ground foliage, or themselves, sometimes breaking entirely by standing still or A-pose floating. They feel barely functional at points. They move like the brain NPCs in that Serious Sam Easter egg. They can and will deflect a lot of blows, but again, just back up and gradually hit them. They are never going to flank you or do something other than gently saunter forward. It totally lacks any challenge beyond menial timing, and it really drags down the experience for me. There are a lot of other ways to engage in combat. You can throw things, do a Postal 2 kick, or daze people with your camera, but I hardly saw a point when what I was doing already staggered people. Since most maps are very close quarters, crowd control kind of just happens, perhaps without intention. Foes will just huddle up and there will be multiple instances where I accidentally killed multiple people in a single hammer swing. I never picked up weaker, faster weapons unless I had no other choice. There really isn't a good reason not to constantly grab the endless breadcrumb trail of hammers aside from preference. They are one of the most common items with the highest damage dealing, behind the hatchet and axe, which were very fun to use on occasion because they can sometimes one-shot with the decapitation. I didn't find the combat getting stale or frustrating. I still think the core of it was very satisfying, enough to carry my campaign playthrough of around 2 hours, but it lacked a lot of what I feel to be required complexity. But even if there was some miracle patch to add more of a buffer or end lag on certain items in a more substantial way, it would be somewhat wasted on these sitting ducks. Also doesn't help you have like melee Marth grabbing range. Like, my word, how are some of these hits connecting? However, not all is bad. This is without a doubt, aesthetically, Szymanski's most ambitious game. The entire campaign has this vile, shock-jock exploitation film vibe, with the UI being made to look like VHS displays. You collect VHS tapes as both armor and save points, which is a very interesting blend. But it does feel a little underbaked because of the game's relatively short length. Just save once per area, except for the very last area. It gets kinda stupid there. Every location is grimy and disgusting and full of stained mattresses, human remains, whatever else. We play as an unknown man entering the town of Butcher's Creek to find snuff films for our consumption. If you don't know what a snuff film is, it is a film of someone being hurt or killed meant to be distributed, and our protagonist is a freak who's really into that stuff. Grimy shacks, run-down houses, an adult studio, even a factory, every location feels frightening to explore, but not enough to deter bludgeoning someone to death while you're naked with a hammer. The sound design here is nothing short of a masterstroke. Every environment feels so lovingly constructed and carefully planned that I felt nothing short of total immersion. A lot of the ambience does kind of feel like it's riffing off of Throbbing Gristle, but that's not a bad thing whatsoever. It's such a filthy world where the sun has been blocked out. Oh yeah, did I mention that? The game flies past the fact that in the beginning intro, there's no sun, apparently. Every sound effect is true to life. Every stroke of our weaponry. It is empirically the best produced Szymanski game. There were like 2 to 3 puzzles present, but they really are some baffling examples of moon logic. Take this one here. We saw the layout in another room, but copying that does nothing. We have to like spin the puzzle on its axis instead. What tells you to do this? I don't know, man. I didn't find that. I don't even know if there is anything. Or how about this door lock where the way to find the code is on some random, really easily missed graffiti? The puzzles felt like an afterthought that didn't have more than a couple seconds put into them, like a last-minute inclusion in one of the drearier Sierra Online games. Our foes are some real scum of the earth. This isn't just a small cabal of demented hicks. We've stumbled across another violent cult worshipping hellish forces, as we are tend to do, and the big bad head is a completely unknown entity referred to as the Watcher, which requires snuff films to be fed to it to satiate it or something. I have not been keeping track whatsoever, but we have to be hitting double digits for distinct cults that worship hell, right? How many of there are these? We learn about this through various notes from members of this hick cult. And by various, I mean a ridiculous, copious amount of notes left in nearly every room, which just feels excessive and not entertaining to read all throughout. A lot of these notes are, okay, let's kill this guy, but said with a bureaucratic twist, which does get a little dry pretty early on through the constant repetition. But in order to understand the deeper story going on, we have to read more. There is a kind of prophecy that in a time of dissent among the cult, some guy will come in, wielding a pickaxe, and slaughter them, then do something with the Watcher called Crimson Communion to bring about the end of days. If the pickaxe at the end of the game isn't clear enough, we are said prophesized one meant to commune with the Watcher. The end of the game sees us doing so. We run into this fleshy abomination and get a violently flashing screen that literally says the Crimson Communion. But what the Watcher didn't know is that we loved every second of it. The world apparently ends off-screen, which concludes Butcher's Creek officially. But there's far more to this than meets the eye. A recurring enemy type are these guys with pony heads. Like, the Pony Factory ponies. The cat is totally out of the bag here. There is a growing connected universe within Szymanski's games. There's currently a trilogy dubbed The Night Fever, consisting of Squirrel Stapler, The Pony Factory, and now Butcher's Creek. But if you really wanted to squint the smaller details, it could go further beyond. Anyone who's played Iron Lung will recall the skeleton, which looks remarkably like a pony, and recall that the world basically ended with the Quiet Rapture, which took most people off the face of the planet and the cosmos instantly. I'm not saying the apparent apocalypse is the Quiet Rapture here, but there are a lot of repeated themes and ideas and factors. Far too many to be a coincidence. Whatever story happening here will be a tale for another day. But I really can't rank Butcher's Creek as anything higher than being kind of middling. What's good here is very impressive, but the negatives are just so damning that outside of a major update that would totally change enemy AI and some of the combat, I don't see that changing anytime soon. It was just kind of too ambitious. I was just gonna leave it at that, but I discovered this YouTube video Szymanski released in 2023 describing how much of a nightmare Butcher's Creek was to work on. He had started development around 2019, but due to shifting interests and other requirements, the game ended up not coming out until 2025. In his own words, he would abandon the project temporarily when the roadblock proved to be too much, but always came back to it every so often.
I've been working on this game off and on for 5 years. And the reason is I keep getting to a point where I'm like, I can't, this is not gonna work. And I just have to abandon this and do something else, and then I go do something else, and then I come back to this.
Butcher's Creek was an exceptionally poignant case of development hell from a developer who will often admit that he is an exceptionally poor programmer. It makes sense Butcher's Creek ended up so troubled because of this, but I do think it does inadvertently expose a sort of dark side to Szymanski's design philosophy. He admitted that Butcher's Creek didn't, and probably would never, match the game he wanted to make, but he did release it anyways. He doesn't always give himself more than a straight year of consistent development time, which is a pretty small amount of time to not only release a game, but fix an incredibly complicated and extremely frustrating project to work on. But despite all of it, he did release it in the current state. Current state not being unplayably buggy or broken somehow, just kind of weirdly inconsistent and maybe lacking a bit of depth. Like maybe it could be animations or just some other added dimension of complexity that a lot of people felt was kind of missing. Not to the point of this being an outright bad or even disappointing game, but you can tell there was just a little bit more that could have been put here. I'd be a total hypocrite to say I haven't been guilty of this as well, if not more. There are plenty of videos I've released in states I wasn't entirely comfortable with either because of a sponsorship deadline or because I just could not stand to look at it anymore. It's an incredibly relatable trait, but not something you really want to encourage with that specific development style. I don't think I found any reason why it had to come out in January or even 2025. I think it really needed more time to bake in the oven. Butcher's Creek is messy, inherently so, and that is the most common opinion among fans. Some people liked it more than I did, some less, but almost everyone universally agreed it could have been much more, but wasn't. Butcher's Creek wants to be cohorts with games like Condemned, Manhunt, Postal, games that wrap themselves in depraved aesthetics and rush headfirst into shocking violence, but it only ended up being an imitation. That's currently where we stand as of March 2025, and who knows what the future holds. I hate to end on a bit of a sour note, but that's not where the story ends. Trying to predict what David Szymanski's next move is like trying to predict tomorrow's news. You might be able to have a grasp on it from an educated guess, but sometimes things just happen and you have to deal with it. Let's compare Fingerbones and Butcher's Creek. Fingerbones was released in 2014, and while Butcher's Creek was released in the first month of 2025, come on now, it's a game that was basically finished in the last days of 2024. This is what 10 years of Unity experience looks like. How far one man's drive and ambition can go. What his career has been so far. He started out as a young man with dreams about Myst and DOOM, and making a shooter game into someone who was able to make not only a small living as he produced games while he gradually learned Unity, that evolved from meeting people at New Blood to make not one, but 2 wildly popular games that would define the company. He moved on to producing the games he wanted to see in the world. Short, jam-packed adventures with a focus on horror and themes of isolation, religious indoctrination, guilt. Fingerbones was his first publicly released Unity game, and Butcher's Creek is his last. He's announced he's moving on from Unity, partially because Unity kind of publicly imploded a couple years ago, and he's now pitching his tent with Godot, a wise decision. I decided to make this video at the perfect time because I feel like this decade of Unity is the best metric to chart out and analyze his career and path as a game developer. Here's my final tier list, by the way. I'm sure a lot of people will disagree with some of my placements, but that's the beautiful thing about his games, is that there's always something new or different or original, some kind of left turn that just makes it different enough to be your favorite. I'm sure there's someone out there who loves Fingerbones and might have it as their number 1, or someone who's really upset at put Music Machine so low. People vary all the time, and there are very few games that are very consistent choices. I really recommend you put your own personal ranking below in the comments section. I'd love to see what people think, and see if I have garbage opinions or if other people have garbage opinions. But the fruits of his labor don't extend to games, but also the movie business. Oh yeah, I'm serious. Markiplier's making an Iron Lung movie. No, I'm not kidding whatsoever. Markiplier is directing a movie based off of Iron Lung, and I think Jacksepticeye's in it too? A lot of the details are kept under wraps at the moment, but currently the movie is apparently done and just awaiting release or something like that. Film adaptations of video games are nothing new, but for an indie game to get one so close on release, helmed by an internet celebrity, it's well worthy of all the praise it's gotten. When will it come out? Who knows. He's also written a book published on Amazon called Monkey Aladdin, released in 2022. His opportunities are endless, but there is one project I've always wanted to see him tackle, and that's a good old-fashioned horror point-and-click, like Scratches. Szymanski has said he is hesitant to do so because the genre isn't very popular at the moment, so it would have to be a pure passion project. But clearly the man knows how to build an atmosphere and make a short, engaging narrative. I would be delighted to see what kind of environments the game would be set in, how he would really explore a more traditional narrative style with long paragraphs of descriptions and dialogue. Who knows when he'll get around to it, if ever, but I will remain ever faithful. Something that's always safe with Szymanski. Even his more disappointing and even lackluster games are always curved by their cheap price points and polish. I have never felt ripped off or cheated of an experience when buying one of his games. It's what makes him so respectable. Because at the end of the day, beyond being a game developer, he's just a man with a public YouTube channel, a man who will admit his flaws and delight in his strengths. This video will become outdated basically immediately, because he's currently working on something new, and I cannot wait to see where this video stands in 2034. He's currently producing another game for his brother Evan called Secret Agent Wizard Boy in the International Crime Syndicate, wow what a mouthful, that's set to release on Early Access one day after I finish this script. He's doing something new with Dread XP, and beyond that, who knows what's next. Szymanski is a Polish name meaning son of Simon. Simon being a rendition of Simon, which means to be heard or to listen. And that's exactly what he's done his entire career. I see this as half, or maybe even a third of his career, this decade-long history. And the next decade is sure to do a lot of things, and I can't wait to see what it brings. Games? More movies? A book? Who knows? I hope this was an adequate look at David Szymanski's games throughout the years, so that I, and all of you brothers and sisters, could gain a better understanding of the man behind the curtain, to understand the heart of his work and what he likes to make, to gain such a complete understanding of a person's body of work, while leaving some room for you to play the games on your own. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope to see much more of you very soon. But until then, have a lovely rest of your day.